At 23:40 on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll C. Smith crouched in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at McGuire Field, Mindoro, watching his radar operator track a contact moving at 180 knots through the black skies north of the Philippine Islands. He was 26 years old, with 43 combat missions and 4 confirmed kills. That night, the Japanese had sent 12 bombers to destroy the American airfields. Smith knew the pattern. For 2 weeks, Japanese bombers had attacked Mindoro every single night. 334 air raid alerts in 14 days. American engineers were building 2 airfields to support the Lingayen Gulf invasion, and the Japanese understood exactly what those airfields meant. If American fighters could operate from Mindoro, they could cover the entire invasion force. Construction had to be stopped. So the bombers came every night. Conventional bombers, kamikazes, anything that could carry explosives. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Mindoro on December 26, just 3 days earlier. Smith's squadron was the only thing standing between those bombers and 20,000 American troops sleeping in tents below. The pressure was suffocating. Every bomber that got through meant dead engineers, dead construction crews, damaged airfields, a delayed invasion, and more American casualties at Lingayen Gulf. Smith's P-61 was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. The Northrop Black Widow was the first American aircraft designed specifically for night combat, with a 66-foot wingspan and twin Pratt & Whitney R, 2,800 engines producing 2,000 horsepower each. Its top speed was 366 miles per hour. But the real weapon wasn't the 4 20mm cannons mounted in the belly. It was the SCR-720 radar in the nose. That radar could detect aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese had no idea it existed. Their bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them invisible. They were wrong. The radar operator sat behind Smith in a separate compartment, watching a glowing screen that revealed every aircraft within range. Lieutenant Philip Porter was Smith's radar operator. He had been tracking targets for 6 months and knew how to read the scope, how to vector Smith toward contacts, and how to separate friendly aircraft from enemy bombers. The problem was simple and brutal. 1 P-61 against 12 Japanese bombers. If Smith engaged one target, 11 others could slip through to bomb the airfields. Even if he shot down 3 or 4 bombers, the rest would complete their mission. American casualties would mount. The airfield would be damaged, and the invasion schedule would slip. Smith had trained for this moment for 18 months. Night fighter training at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida. Radar intercept procedures. Night navigation. Gunnery practice in total darkness. The training was exhaustive because night fighting was the most dangerous form of aerial combat. There were no visual references, no horizon. Only instruments, radar returns, and the constant fear that the target you were tracking might be friendly. The 418th had flown its first combat mission in November 1943 from primitive airstrips in New Guinea, first flying P-70 Havocs, and then modified P-38 Lightnings with experimental radar. The P-61s arrived in September 1944. The Black Widow was everything the earlier night fighters were not. Stable, forgiving, powerful, and equipped with radar that actually worked. But radar alone couldn't solve Smith's problem tonight. 12 bombers were coming. His fuel would last maybe 3 hours. If he spent 10 minutes engaging each target, he could intercept only 3 bombers before he had to return to base. 9 bombers would get through. 9 bombers meant hundreds of casualties, maybe thousands if they hit fuel dumps or ammunition storage. Porter's voice crackled through the intercom at 23:42. He had 4 separate contacts on the scope, all heading south toward Mindoro at different altitudes. Smith had to make a choice, which bomber pursue first, and whether his plan to intercept all 4 in a single night was genius or suicide. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin R 2,800 engines responded instantly as the Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out vectors. Heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith couldn't see anything to the canopy. No moon, no stars, just total blackness and heavy clouds. This was exactly why the Japanese had chosen tonight. Complete darkness made their bombers invisible to conventional fighters. But Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar used a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the nose, sending out microwave pulses across a 180-degree arc. When those pulses struck an aircraft, they bounced back as a glowing blip on the radar scope. One display showed azimuth left or right of the aircraft's nose. The other showed elevation above or below. Porter watched both simultaneously, guiding Smith with calm, precise corrections, left 5 degrees, down 3. The system worked because Porter was exceptional at his job. Range 3 miles. Smith activated his own radar scope. A smaller display was integrated into the main instrument panel. Once the target was close enough, Smith could track it himself. The pilot scope was simpler than Porter's, a single display showing range and relative position, but it was enough. Once Smith had the target on his scope, he could close for the kill without relying on verbal instructions. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Americans as a Betty. It used 2,000 horsepower Mitsubishi Kasi engines, had a maximum speed of 270 miles per hour, a crew of 7, and a bomb load of 1,760 pounds. The Betty had a critical weakness: no self-sealing fuel tanks. One burst from Smith's cannons would turn the bomber into a fireball. Range 2 miles. Smith could see the target clearly on his scope now. The blip was steady. The bomber crew had no idea Smith was behind them. Japanese bombers had no tail-warning radar, no way to detect a pursuing night fighter. They flew in darkness, believing they were safe. The P-61 made that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards, still unable to see the Betty visually. The darkness was absolute. He relied entirely on radar. The blip grew larger as the range closed. 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally saw it, a dark shape against slightly lighter clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible, faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. Smith maneuvered the P-61 into position, slightly below and behind the bomber. The four 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage, fixed forward, meaning Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel, projecting an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass. Smith adjusted his position until the bomber sat perfectly centered. Range 400 yards. He armed the cannons. Each carried 200 rounds, 800 rounds total. Enough for roughly 40 seconds of sustained fire, but Smith wouldn't need that long. Night fighter doctrine called for short, concentrated bursts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill, move on. Wasting ammunition on one bomber meant fewer rounds for the rest. Smith squeezed the trigger at 350 yards. All four cannons fired in unison. The sound was deafening even through the engine noise. 20mm high-explosive shells streaked toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second, tracers drawing red lines through the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds, 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled hard to the right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall, the burning aircraft lighting the clouds below. It hit the water 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57. One bomber down, 11 remaining. Smith's fuel gauge showed he had already burned 15% of his fuel. 3 more contacts were still on Porter's scope, all heading toward the airfields, all separated by miles of black sky. Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Porter identified the second target at 0014 on December 30th, heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned south and descended. Geometry was the enemy. The second bomber was 23 miles from the first kill. At a cruising speed of 280 miles per hour, Smith needed roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes in which the bomber moved closer to Mindoro and closer to releasing its bombs. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster, up to 320 miles per hour. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate at that setting. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. But if he didn't intercept quickly, the bomber would reach the target zone. American anti-aircraft guns would open fire. The The bomber might be shot down, or it might drop its bombs. Either outcome meant failure. The mathematics of night interception were brutal. Most missions ended without contact. The sky was enormous, and even with radar, finding one bomber required perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Finding 4 in one night bordered on impossible. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills total since arriving in the Pacific, 18 kills in 14 months. Smith already had 4 to his name. Adding 4 more in one night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the war, but records didn't matter. Stopping the bombers did. Porter called out corrections. Smith adjusted his heading. The second contact grew stronger. 4 miles, 3-2. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile, another Betty with the same vulnerable fuel tanks. This one was lower, at 6,000 feet, closer to the cloud layer, leaving Smith less room to maneuver. He positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast, and he would overshoot. Too slow, and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters depended on surprise. Once detected, everything changed. Bomber crews maneuvered. Gunners opened fire. Clean intercepts turned into deadly dogfights. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly. Flying straight and level, no evasive action, no indication the crew knew he was there. The P-61's black paint made it nearly invisible at night, and its engines were quieter than most fighters. The Japanese feared the Black Widow, but fear meant nothing if they didn't know it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range 350 yards. He fired. A 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The shells ripped through the fuselage. The right engine ignited instantly, then the left. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and plunged toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water at 0019, 17 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers were down. 10 remained, and Smith's fuel gauge read 42%. Porter still had 2 contacts, both closer to Muro than the previous targets and at different altitudes, one at 9,000 feet and one at 4,000, separated by 8 miles. Smith made his decision. He would take the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than a rapid descent, but also meant allowing the lower bomber to move closer to the airfields. One wrong choice and a bomber would get through, turning the mission into a failure. Smith turned north and climbed, reaching 9,000 feet at 0023. Porter locked onto the third contact, range 7 miles, heading 160, speed 190 knots. This bomber was different. It was faster than the Betty and already taking evasive action, turning and changing altitude. Someone aboard new American night fighters were in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki, 49 Donryu, known to the Americans as a Helen, faster than the Betty, with a top speed of 306 miles per hour and better defensive armament, including heavy machine guns and a tail gunner with a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. A straight approach from the rear would put Smith directly in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his plan. Instead of coming straight in from behind, he approached from below and to the left, exploiting the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable, and Smith intended to use it. The range dropped to 1 mile. The Helen continued evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, descending 300. The pilot was experienced and understood that straight and level flight made him an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Porter compensated by predicting the bomber's movements, watching the pattern, anticipating the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot made a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration gave it excellent stability, and the aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith kept the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streamed past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds to act before the bomber pilot began aggressive evasive maneuvers. He squeezed the trigger. a 3-second burst, 72 rounds. Longer than his previous attacks, but necessary. The Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the bomber's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The aircraft rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith broke away to avoid debris as the burning bomber fell through 9,000 feet, then 8,000, then 7,000. It struck the water at 0029. 29 minutes after midnight. 3 bombers were down. 9 remained. Smith's fuel gauge showed 28%. Critical. Most pilots returned to base at 30%. Below that, any delay risked a forced landing. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant death. No visual references, no margin for error. Porter still had one contact on his scope. The 4th target, heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, flying low. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro. Smith could see the American searchlights, sweeping the sky, thin white beams cutting through the darkness. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Smith descended toward the 4th bomber. Diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, then 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage mattered. He could dive in, increase speed, shorten reaction time. Range 4 miles, 3, 2. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another Betty. The bomber flew straight toward Mindoro. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were present or didn't care. Japanese crews often accepted death as the cost of mission success. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind. Range 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds remaining, enough for several attacks. But this was the 4th target. Every round mattered. Fuel showed 23%. Below margins. 1 chance. 1 burst. Smith fired at 0034. 2-second burst. 48 rounds. The shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The port wings separated cleanly. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread instantly. The bomber rolled left and dove. It struck the ocean at 0035. 35 minutes after midnight. For bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned back toward Mindoro. Fuel showed 21%. The math was simple. McGuire Field lay 18 miles south. The P-61 burned roughly 100 gallons per hour at cruise. Smith had about 60 gallons left, enough for 36 minutes. Enough if nothing went wrong. Porter scanned his radar. No contacts. The remaining Japanese bombers had turned back. Why didn't matter? The airfields were safe. No American casualties. Construction continued uninterrupted. The Lingayen Gulf invasion remained on schedule. At 0042, Porter detected a new contact. Heading north. Range 4 miles. Altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. 12 miles from McGuire Field. Fuel at 19%. The contact lay between him and the base. If it was Japanese and heading toward Mindoro, letting it pass meant risking lives. Engaging it risked fuel exhaustion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles. 2. 1. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. Not a bomber. A Nakajima 84-8. The Americans called it Frank. Single-engine fighter. Maximum speed 392 miles per hour for heavy machine guns. 2 20mm cannons. One of the best fighters Japan had. Faster and more maneuverable than the P-61 in daylight. But this wasn't daylight. The Frank pilot had no radar and no visual references. Smith had the advantage. The enemy didn't know he was there. Smith slid in below and behind. Range 500 yards. Same approach. Get close. Fire. Finish it. Fighters were smaller targets. Harder to kill. Smith closed to 300 yards. Fuel showed 17%. 1 attempt. Miss, and he would have to disengage immediately. Miss, and the enemy would know night fighters were operating here. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger tightened on the trigger. Fuel calculations said engaging would drop him below safety margins, but letting the fighter go risked American lives. The P-61 held steady at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware. Smith made a decision at 0045. He fired. 3-second burst. 72 rounds. The longest burst of the night. The shells ripped through the Frank's tail and engine cowling. The engine erupted in flame. Black smoke poured out. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it fall through 7,000 feet, then 6,000, then 5,000. At 3,000 feet, the pilot bailed out. A white parachute blossomed against the black sky. The fighter continued down and struck the water at 0046. Smith checked his fuel. 15%. Lower than expected. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. Any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass, with McGuire Field on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days, with minimal lighting and no instrument landing system. Night landings relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps appeared as dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gallons total. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided roughly 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, that meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel? Barely. At 0052, Smith spotted the runway lights. 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet long with a crushed coral surface. Engineers had completed construction on December 26, the same day the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations but lacked safety features. No overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. At night, with minimal lighting, any error would likely be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, 57 gallons. The P-61 consumed fuel faster during landing approach as power settings fluctuated. Smith calculated approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough to land unless something went wrong. At 0055, something did. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway, altitude 800 feet, airspeed 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference. The P-61 would hit the ground before he realized how low he was flying. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter, accurate within 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning navigation, touching down when the altimeter read 0. The technique was dangerous. Any navigation error meant landing off the runway, into jungle, coral, or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time. Not enough to divert. Tacloban on Leyte was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. The P-61 would run out of fuel 40 miles short. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights or crash into the ocean. The decision was simple. Smith had survived 4 bomber intercepts and 1 fighter engagement. 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single-night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific. He had protected the airfields and enabled the Lingayen Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the mission meaningless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway lay. Altitude 600 feet. Fuel at 9%. Darkness below was absolute. He descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter read 380 feet AGL. Airspeed reduced to 120 knots. Stall speed with full flaps was 95 knots, leaving a 25-knot margin. Slower descent would burn more fuel. Porter monitored the radar scope. Murrow's coastline was clear. McGuire Field lay inland, 1 mile from the beach. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north on heading 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle or coral. At 0058, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green lights confirmed all wheels down and locked. The P-61's gear was robust, designed for rough fields, but without visual cues, Smith couldn't judge touchdown. A hard impact could collapse the gear and cartwheel the aircraft. At 120 knots, survival was unlikely. Fuel showed 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes remaining. Smith extended full flaps. Airspeed dropped to 110 knots. Descent rate stabilized at 300 feet per minute. Radar altimeter, 250 feet, 200, 150. Still no ground visible. At 100 feet, Smith reduced power. Descent increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal but necessary. 75 feet, 50, 25. Smith braced. The main wheel struck crushed coral at 0059. The impact was hard, but the gear held. The nose will touch down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. Speed bled off, 100 knots, 80, 60, 40, until the aircraft stopped at taxi speed. He held the brakes, unable to see his position. Fuel showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights and guided him to parking. The engine shut down at 0103, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out, legs stiff, hands shaking, not from fear but exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes. Porter emerged from the radar compartment. He had tracked every target, guided each intercept, and maintained contact throughout. Without Porter, none of the kills or the landing would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort, pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The ground crew inspected the P-61. No damage. All 4 cannons had functioned correctly. Total ammunition expended, 408 rounds. Smith had launched with 800 rounds and landed with 392 remaining, enough for 2 more intercepts, but with no fuel to pursue additional targets. Intelligence officers arrived at 0115. They wanted details: times, locations, altitudes, aircraft types. Smith provided everything from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki, 49 Helen bomber, and 1 Nakajima Ki, 84 Frankfighter, all destroyed between 2357 on December 29th and 0046 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The kills were confirmed through multiple sources. Ground radar tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported aircraft crashing into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light, exactly where Smith reported. 4 bombers and 1 fighter. 4 kills in 1 night equaled the American night fighter record. But Smith wasn't finished. On December 30th, 1944, at 1,430 hours, Smith flew his second mission of the day. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted over Muro. Single-engine fighters, faster than bombers, harder to intercept. Smith and Porter took off again in the same P-61, refueled and rearmed with 800 rounds of 20 mm ammunition and 646 gallons of fuel. At 1512, Porter detected a contact heading north at 12,000 feet, 8 miles out. Smith climbed to intercept. The target was another Nakajima Ki, 84 Frank, faster than the P-61 in level flight, but Smith held the altitude advantage. He dove from above, accelerating to 390 miles per hour, exceeding the Frank's maximum level speed. Smith fired at 400 yards, a 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and plunged into the ocean. Smith's 7th kill. That final victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Muro through January 1945, scoring 18 total kills, the highest of any P-61 squadron in the Pacific. Smith's 7 accounted for 39% of the unit's total. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. Without his skill, none of the intercepts would have been possible. The P-61 times A Waston continued flying combat missions through May 1945. It survived the war undamaged, then was scrapped after VJ Day along with most Black Widows. Only 4 P-61s exist today. None is Smith's aircraft. The nose art, the kill markings, the machine that hunted 4 bombers in one night, lost to history. McGuire Field supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from Muro provided air cover. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs hitting the construction areas would have delayed completion by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant a delayed invasion, higher casualties, and a longer war. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, and never sought publicity. He never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement lie in archives, unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions completed. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could do. 700 were built and flown in every theater: Europe, Pacific, China, Burma, India, Mediterranean. From 1944 to 1945, it dominated night combat. After the war, it was redesignated F-61. Served until 1954, then was replaced by jet night fighters. But in December 1944 over Muro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the best pilot flying it.